On the night of celebration, when laughter spilled across golden-lit halls, his son looked at him with a cold smile and said, "You should be grateful we even invited you." The words landed like a blade across his chest, sharper than any insult he had endured in silence. It was not love that had opened the door to him, not honor, not belonging. It was pity, coated in arrogance, offered as if to a beggar. He was not a guest. He was a tolerated shadow, forced into their gathering like an afterthought, and already he felt the weight of betrayal pressing against his ribs. They handed him the invitation with a smirk, as though it were charity. "At least you get to be here," they whispered, their voices low but sharp enough to cut. Every syllable reminded him that his presence was framed, not as a right earned through years of sacrifice, but as a debt he owed to them. As if the roof above their heads, the food on their plates, the very comfort they now flaunted, had not been built upon the silent strength of his hands. Their eyes told him the truth. They believed he should kneel in gratitude for the chance to sit among them. When he arrived, the first wound was not the words, but the seat they gave him. Not near the center where family laughed and glasses clinked, but at the farthest corner of the long, polished table, where the chandelier's light barely reached. He sat beneath shadows, a man displaced in his own bloodline. Every chair closer to the center was filled with arrogance, laughter, and the shallow pride of those who forgot who had lifted them to such heights. Their conversations flowed easily around him, but not once through him, as if he were furniture left in the room by accident. The son-in-law raised his glass, smirk tugging at his lips, and said loudly, "It's good to have everyone important gathered here tonight." The room laughed. He did not. For the first time in years, he understood the cruelty in their hospitality. They had not invited him as family. They had summoned him as an ornament, a reminder to themselves that they were merciful enough to give him a place at their table. The sting of that realization was worse than silence. His daughter would not meet his eyes. She adjusted the silverware in front of her, fingers trembling just slightly, but her lips pressed tightly shut. No defense came. Not a word of warmth, not a gesture to erase the wound inflicted. And so the night began with chains invisible, with the heavy iron of humiliation disguised as kindness. Inside he swallowed the fire rising in his chest. Betrayal has many voices, some loud, some quiet. But the quietest one of all, the one that hurt most, was the one that said, "Be grateful. Without us, you would be nothing." They had forgotten the truth, and before the night was done, that truth would stand taller than their pride. Friends, let me take a short pause here. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching this story from? Has anything like this ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. It truly helps us grow this channel. And now, we continue. They placed him at the far corner, the chair waiting like an afterthought, tucked into the shadows where the chandelier's light thinned and dimmed. It was not a seat of honor, not even a seat of welcome. It was a seat of exile. Around the long polished table, golden glasses clinked, silver shone, voices rose with ease, yet none of it reached him. He sat there, his presence swallowed by the laughter that rolled past him as if he were invisible, as if he had been carved out of the room and placed only as a formality. The hum of conversations moved like a current, swift and bright. But when it neared him, it broke away, curving around his silence like a river avoiding a stone. He watched his own daughter lean in toward others, her face lit with the same warmth she had once reserved for him, back when she was small and her hand fit into his without fear. Now her smiles belonged to others, to those who had earned nothing of what she gave so freely. To him, she offered only silence. Every glance in his direction was fleeting, almost accidental, as though acknowledging him would pollute the brilliance of the evening. He was there, yet not there. The scrape of forks against plates was louder than any attempt to draw him into their world. They were feasting not just on food, but on arrogance, and every bite left him more starved. The far corner became more than a seat. It was a sentence. It told him he was tolerated, not welcomed, endured, not embraced. To them, he was a relic that could be displayed for pity, but never honored for truth. They forgot the nights he had sat at empty tables so they could one day sit at tables like this. They forgot the ink of his sacrifices, written not on paper, but in the lines of his face, the calluses of his hands. He lifted his glass once, not in toast, but in quiet defiance, though no one noticed. They toasted to themselves, to successes built on foundations they never questioned. And all the while, the man who had laid those foundations sat in silence, hidden in shadows, watching the family he had raised feast on the fruits of his labor, as though he had been nothing more than a stranger who stumbled in from the cold. And yet, beneath the weight of that humiliation, something stirred. Betrayal is sharp, but justice is patient. He sat at the edge of their table, but not at the edge of his story. One day, even the farthest corner would become the center of their attention, and every careless glance, every dismissive silence would return to them with a weight heavier than they could bear. The laughter began like a ripple, soft at first, then sharper, cutting through the air until it filled every corner of the room, except his. At the far end of the table, where shadows gathered, he felt each sound strike against him like pebbles thrown at glass. Their eyes darted in his direction, not with warmth, not with respect, but with that quiet cruelty reserved for those they believed beneath them. Every chuckle was a reminder that his presence was not honor, but burden, tolerated only so they could parade their generosity to themselves. He sat still, his hands folded, the weight of their mockery pressing down heavier than the chandelier above their heads. To them he was lucky, lucky to sit among them, lucky to breathe their air, lucky not to be left outside the very doors he had once opened for them with his sacrifices. The word echoed in his chest like poison. Lucky. As though the years he had labored, the nights he had gone hungry, the debts he had cleared for their comfort, were nothing more than dust scattered in the wind. He watched as they leaned closer to one another, whispering behind hands that failed to mask the sharpness of their smirks. He knew those whispers were about him, the outsider at his own blood's table. Their laughter rose again, louder this time, polished with arrogance, and though no words were spoken aloud, he could hear their meaning as clear as thunder. You don't belong here. Pride and humiliation wrestled within him. One part of him longed to rise, to remind them of truths they had buried under years of comfort. Another part urged him to remain silent, to let the storm pass, to carry his dignity like armor, even as it was pierced again and again. His chest ached with the weight of it, the fire of unspoken words burning against the walls of his throat. The meal before him blurred. He no longer tasted, no longer smelled. He only heard. Laughter sharper than knives, whispers colder than steel, glances that cut deeper than any blade. They thought they were strong in their mockery, safe in their arrogance. But they did not understand that every wound inflicted on him was not weakness, it was memory. And memories, though buried in silence, have a way of rising when least expected, like storms breaking against calm seas. That night they laughed at him as though he were small, as though he were invisible. But he knew, though they did not, that laughter is fragile. It fades quickly, while truth waits. And when truth comes, it never whispers. It roars. The son-in-law leaned forward, his elbows spread across the white cloth like he owned the very table, his smile dripping with condescension. He did not need to shout. Arrogance has its own volume. His voice slid through the room, smooth, practiced, loud enough that every ear would catch it. "You wouldn't understand business," he said, and though the words were few, they struck with the force of a hammer. The laughter that followed wasn't his alone. It belonged to the entire table, to those eager to echo cruelty so they wouldn't stand accused of silence. For a moment, the father did not move. He stared at his plate, his fingers steady, though inside his chest something cracked. This was not the insult of a stranger. This was the wound of betrayal sharpened by family ties. He remembered the day he had helped that same son-in-law find his footing, guided him through storms he never acknowledged. The contracts, the risks, the late nights spent writing guarantees so the young man could build his name on the strength of another's reputation. His reputation. And now, in front of everyone, that history was erased with a single smirk, replaced by mockery dressed as superiority. The others shifted in their chairs, some amused, some silent, none brave enough to break the cruelty. His daughter lowered her eyes, pretending to fuss with her glass, unwilling to defend the man who had once been her shield. That silence hurt more than the words themselves. It was betrayal not spoken but lived, louder than any insult. The sting of the son-in-law's words did not rest only in their arrogance, but in their precision. He had chosen them to strip dignity, to remind the room that this man, the father, was no longer part of the new order. It was a public stripping, a humiliation staged so laughter would finish what silence had begun. Yet in that very moment, the father's silence became his shield. For silence, unlike mockery, does not decay. It lingers. It grows heavier with every arrogant word spoken against it, until at last it crushes the weight of false pride. Inside, pride and pain wrestled, but beneath both burned something deeper, the calm certainty of truth. The son-in-law thought he had triumphed with a smirk that his cruelty had pushed the older man further into the shadows, but what he did not know, what none of them knew, was the shadows have a way of holding secrets until the light is forced to expose them, and when the light came, it would not shine on the son-in-law's triumph. It would burn through it, leaving only the ruins of arrogance. That night, the table belonged to the son-in-law and his laughter. But the future was patient. And justice does not hurry. It waits, it watches, and when it arrives, it leaves no space for smirks. She did not look at him, not once. Her eyes stayed fixed on the napkin in her hands, folding and unfolding, as if that small piece of cloth could shield her from the weight of truth pressing into the room. He waited, hoped even, that she would lift her gaze, that she would offer a single word, a single gesture, to cut through the humiliation he had been forced to endure. But silence poured from her like ice water, colder than the sharpest insult. He remembered her as a child, how she once ran to him with scraped knees, how her voice trembled when she asked him to stay by her bed during storms. In those moments, she had trusted him more than anyone in the world. Now she sat only a few feet away, yet the distance felt infinite, a canyon carved not by time but by betrayal. He had carried her in his arms through sickness, sacrificed meals so she would never go hungry, signed away his own comforts so her future could be secure. And yet, on this night, she would not even grant him the dignity of her voice. Silence is not absence, it is a choice. And her choice cut deeper than the son-in-law's mockery. His insult had been arrogance, but hers was abandonment. In every second she remained quiet, he felt the threads of loyalty fray, pulled apart until only a memory remained. Her folded napkin was not a nervous gesture. It was a burial shroud, wrapping the last remnants of their bond and laying them to rest before his eyes. The room swelled with laughter and chatter, but none of it reached him. All he heard was her silence, louder than every word spoken around them. It told him, "I will not stand for you. I will not fight for you. You are alone, and that truth bled into him like poison. Still, he did not move. His pride was fragile, yet it was all he had left. He sat upright, his expression calm, though his chest felt heavy with grief. To speak would have been to beg would have been to surrender. And though he had been pushed to the corner of the table, pushed to the edges of their lives, he would not surrender what remained of his dignity. Her silence became a wall, and on the other side of it stood a father exiled in plain sight. Yet walls have cracks, and one day the truth, long hidden, would break through. And when it did, she would remember this moment, not for her silence, but for what her silence cost. Crystal glasses rose into the air, catching the chandelier's glow and scattering it like fragments of false glory. Voices rose too, weaving together into a chorus of praise, each name called, each achievement lauded, as though the table itself had been built on their brilliance alone. They toasted the son-in-law's clever deals, the daughter's social grace, the nephew's new position at the firm. Every name became a jewel polished by their pride, every name but his. He sat at the edge, his own glass heavy in his hand, though no one thought to include him. No word of his years spent laboring until his back ached, no memory of the nights he had stayed awake to plan, to save, to sacrifice, ensuring the very roof above their heads never collapsed. No acknowledgement that their laughter, their comfort, their very ability to celebrate rested on a foundation he had laid stone by stone. It was as if he had never existed, as if decades of his life had been erased with the stroke of silence. The sound of their cheer was unbearable. It rolled over him like a tide, each wave pulling away another piece of dignity. He raised his glass once, not to join them, but to steady himself. His reflection wavered in the wine, eyes clouded with hurt, but unbroken. He could not compete with their noise, nor did he wish to. Yet the cruelty of omission was a sharper blade than any spoken insult. It was not that they mocked him this time. It was that they denied him entirely. To mock is to acknowledge. To erase is to kill without leaving a body. For a moment memory overtook him. He saw himself younger, at tables smaller and humbler, where his laughter had been the loudest, where his sacrifices had been invisible only because they were constant. He had not asked for gratitude then, nor did he crave it now. What he longed for was recognition that his life had mattered, that the years he poured into them had not vanished like smoke. But the glasses clinked, the names echoed, the cheers grew, and in that deafening celebration, his name was buried deeper than ever. He sat in silence, his dignity wrapped around him like a cloak, knowing that silence can be heavier than words. They had erased him in front of themselves, but the world beyond those walls had not forgotten, and before long their toasts would turn hollow, their praise would sour, and the truth they had buried would rise to the surface, undeniable, unerasable. The dishes arrived in procession, steaming with rich aromas, carried on silver trays as though the food itself were another performance of wealth. Plates were set down before the others first, filled generously, their portions spilling over the rims with abundance. Laughter rose again as they reached for bread, for sauces, for wine to wash it all down. And then, at the far corner of the table, his plate arrived, last. A portion small, almost deliberate, as though the kitchen had run dry by the time it reached him. The server set it down with indifference, and no one noticed. Or worse, they noticed and looked away. He stared at it for a long moment, the meager serving glowing beneath the heavy light of the chandelier, a cruel reflection of his place among them. Even food, the simplest act of sharing, had been twisted into hierarchy. They feasted as heirs, he dined as a beggar. And in that plate he saw the truth spelled out clearly. To them he was not family, not equal, not deserving of the same fullness. He was a guest in name only, rationed kindness as if it were charity given to a stranger. The taste left his mouth before he had even touched the fork. Hunger did not live in his stomach anymore. It lived in his chest, in the hollow ache of dignity stripped bare. He could not remember the last time he had eaten without shame lingering in the room, without feeling that every bite was weighed and measured by eyes that judged whether he deserved it. They had forgotten how many nights he had gone without, ensuring that his children had enough. They had forgotten the years when his calloused hands had lifted heavy crates, when he worked through fevers and storms so no one at this table would ever know hunger. Now, as he looked at the plate before him, he realized the cycle had turned. His sacrifice had been transmuted into their arrogance, his hunger repaid with scorn. And yet he lifted his fork, not because the food tempted him, but because to refuse would have been to acknowledge defeat. He ate slowly, every mouthful bitter, every glance around the table heavier than the last. The laughter seemed louder with each bite, the clinking glasses brighter, as though the room itself celebrated his humiliation. Still, he did not break. The portion on his plate was small, but the portion of truth he carried was larger than any feast. They thought him diminished, reduced to crumbs at their table, but one day they would learn that nothing is so dangerous as a man forced into silence, nothing so powerful as dignity tested by humiliation. For humiliation, unlike food, does not disappear once consumed. It lingers, it grows, it waits, and one day it becomes justice. The laughter around him blurred into a dull roar, a sound distant and hollow, as if it belonged to another world. His eyes lowered to the small plate before him, but what he saw was not the food, it was memory, a flicker of nights long past, when he sat alone at the kitchen table, the lamp burning low, papers scattered before him, numbers refusing to bend, debts demanding answers. He remembered the way his hands shook from exhaustion as he signed the guarantees, promises that would one day become the foundation of their comfort. No one else had been there when the letters from the bank arrived, heavy with threat. No one else had faced the storm. It had been him, always him. He remembered the foundations he had laid, not just of stone and wood, but of life itself. The house they laughed in tonight, every wall had known the sweat of his brow, every beam had been lifted by his calloused hands. He remembered the mornings when his back screamed in protest, but he kept going, because stopping would mean his children would know hunger, and he could not allow that. He remembered the winters when the cold bit through his coat, yet he worked still, so the fire at home would never die. But here, at this table of abundance, no one remembered. Or worse, perhaps they remembered and chose silence, for gratitude has no place in the mouths of the proud. His daughter's eyes, the son-in-law's smirk, the careless laughter of the others, all of it testified to a truth he wished he did not know. They had rewritten the story, casting themselves as architects of a fortune that was not theirs to claim. The heartbeat of memory pulsed in his chest, heavy, insistent. He could feel it with every thud against his ribs, as though his very blood rebelled against the injustice. Pride wrestled with grief. Humiliation gnawed at dignity. Yet beneath it all there was a calm certainty, faint but unshakable. Truth does not disappear because it is ignored. It waits, patient, in the silence of memory, until the day it is called to speak. He sat there listening to their chatter, tasting none of the food, feeling none of the warmth. And though the room was filled with voices, the loudest sound was his own memory, steady as a drumbeat, a heartbeat of sacrifice, a heartbeat of pain, a heartbeat of truth. One they could bury in silence for now, but not forever. The doors opened with a quiet authority, and at once the air in the hall shifted. Conversations faltered. Laughter broke mid-sentence. Forks hovered above plates. A man stepped in, his suit tailored to perfection, the kind of presence that bends a room without a word. He did not belong to their guest list, nor to their plans. Yet the moment he appeared, the very table that had mocked and whispered fell into silence, as if sensing that their feast was about to sour. He moved with the confidence of someone who carried weight, not the borrowed weight of pride, but the earned weight of respect. His polished shoes struck against the floor in measured rhythm, and each step cut through the arrogance that had filled the hall only moments before. Eyes followed him, first with curiosity, then with unease, for in his face there was recognition, but not toward them. His gaze swept across the table once, bypassing the glittering glasses, the smug smiles, the false hosts of the evening. It passed the son-in-law, who stiffened and straightened, mistaking himself for the center of attention. It passed the daughter, who touched her necklace nervously, as if jewels could shield her from shame. And then, at last, his eyes found the man in the shadows at the farthest corner. The silence deepened. In that instant, the laughter of earlier seemed like a sin, a crime committed against dignity itself. Because the truth was clear, this man of stature, of presence, had not come for them. He had come for the one they had pushed to the edge, the one they had silenced, the one they had rationed food and honor to, as though he were unworthy of both. The weight of it pressed against the room. Pride drained from their faces, arrogance cracking like glass under heat. The father felt his chest tighten, not from shame this time, but from something long denied. Recognition. He had been unseen all night, erased from their story, yet here was a man stepping across the hall to rewrite it before their eyes. He did not rise. He did not move, but the room itself leaned toward him as the man in the fine suit advanced. And in the quiet footsteps that echoed across the polished floor, justice had already begun to walk through the door. The manager's gaze cut through the hall like a searchlight, sweeping past the glitter and noise until it found its mark. Not the wealthy son-in-law, who puffed his chest as if already prepared to shake hands and bask in reflected power. Not the daughter, who adjusted her necklace, her face painted with practiced charm, expecting recognition she had not earned. No, his eyes bypassed them both without hesitation, falling instead on the man half hidden at the far corner of the table. The man who had been mocked, silenced, rationed, humiliated. The man they had told was lucky to even sit there. And in that instant, the manager smiled. The room seemed to bend under the weight of that single expression. It was not a casual smile, not the polite curve of lips offered out of duty. It was the kind of smile born of respect, of memory, of gratitude that cannot be faked. It was a smile that rewrote the script of the evening in a single heartbeat. The others at the table stiffened. Their laughter died in their throats. The air grew thick with the sudden knowledge that the man they had diminished was not diminished at all, not in the eyes of one who carried real authority. The father did not move. He sat still, his hands resting gently on the table, his eyes steady, though inside his chest something long buried stirred and rose. For hours he had endured their dismissal, their whispers, their cruel erasure of his name. Yet here was a man whose presence silenced the entire hall, and whose gaze honored him without a single word. It was justice in its purest form, quiet, undeniable, unasked for, but powerful enough to turn humiliation into reverence. The son-in-law's smirk faltered, confusion flickering across his face. The daughter's fingers froze around her wineglass, trembling ever so slightly, and the rest shifted uneasily, as if the very ground beneath the table had tilted. In their eyes he saw something he had not seen all night. Fear. Fear that the truth they had buried was clawing its way back to the surface, carried on the smile of a man they could not ignore. The corner of the table, once a place of exile, had become the center of the room. All eyes, all thoughts, all unspoken questions now orbited around him. And for the first time that night he did not feel small. He felt the steady return of something they had tried to strip away, but could never destroy. Dignity. The manager did not hesitate. His steps echoed against the marble floor, each one breaking apart the fragile pride that had filled the hall only moments before. He moved past the son-in-law, who leaned forward, as if expecting recognition, but was brushed aside without a glance. He moved past the daughter, whose forced smile flickered and died as quickly as it had appeared. He did not slow. He did not falter. His destination was clear from the moment he entered. The man seated in the shadows at the farthest corner of the table. When he reached him, the manager stopped, and with the reverence of one greeting a mentor, extended his hand. "I must thank you," he said, his voice steady, carrying through the silence that had gripped the room. "Without your vision and discipline, I would not be standing where I am today." The words fell like stones into a still pond, rippling outward, shattering the atmosphere of arrogance that had suffocated the evening. Every glass, every fork, every hand at the table froze in place. For hours they had treated him as an afterthought, a burden, a relic tolerated out of pity. And now, before their eyes, a man of power and reputation had declared the opposite, that their lives, their comforts, even their wealth, were rooted in the quiet strength of the one they had dismissed. The father did not rise immediately. He looked at the manager's outstretched hand, then at the faces around the table, faces pale, stunned, broken by the sudden collapse of their illusions. His chest swelled not with pride, but with something deeper, something long denied. Justice. He reached out, his hand steady, his grip firm, and in that simple gesture, the weight of the entire evening shifted. The manager's sincerity was not performance. His eyes carried gratitude that could not be faked. In them, the father saw the echo of the countless sacrifices that had been erased from memory tonight, the loans repaid, the foundations laid, the lessons of resilience passed down quietly to those who had listened. Someone had remembered, someone who mattered, and as their hands met, the walls themselves seemed to tilt. The center of the room was no longer the son-in-law's laughter or the daughter's social posturing. The center was here, where dignity stood unshaken, where truth had finally spoken aloud. It was not anger that filled him, nor triumph, but a quiet vindication stronger than either. He did not need to shout, nor to remind them of what they had erased. The words had been spoken for him, and they had shifted the walls of the hall forever. The hall froze, as if time itself had drawn in a breath and refused to release it. Forks hovered halfway to lips. Glasses trembled in midair. Laughter that only moments ago filled the room hung unfinished, severed mid-note. The son-in-law's smirk, the weapon he had wielded so confidently all night, dissolved from his face, leaving behind only the naked fear of a man exposed. The daughter's napkin slipped soundlessly from her fingers and fell into her lap, her composure unraveling like a thread pulled loose. Every proud back that had straightened in arrogance now bent slightly, as though the weight of truth had dropped suddenly onto their shoulders. The sentence still echoed in the air. "Without your vision and discipline, I would not be standing where I am today." Just one sentence, yet it had shattered the fragile glass of their pride more completely than any storm of anger could have. For it was not rage that condemned them, it was gratitude, spoken openly by a man whose voice carried authority beyond wealth, beyond pretension. They had erased him, reduced him to a shadow, and in one instant that shadow stretched across the entire hall, swallowing their arrogance whole. He did not gloat. He did not rise with fury or triumph. He sat where he had been pushed, in the seat of exile. Yet now the entire table revolved around him. Their silence was louder than their earlier laughter. A silence swollen with shame, with the realization of how blind they had been. Every toast they had made, every whisper, every careless dismissal, turned back upon them like knives. The son-in-law gripped his glass tighter, but his hand trembled, the wine inside rippling like a mirror to his crumbling confidence. The daughter's eyes darted once toward her father, then away, as though the sight of him burned. The others shifted in unease, no longer able to pretend he was invisible. He was no longer the man lucky to be invited. He was the man their own guest of honor had sought out above all. And in that silence, he found vindication. He did not need their words, their belated apologies, their shallow gestures. The truth had been spoken for him, carved into the very air they breathe. Pride had collapsed, arrogance had shattered, and dignity, his dignity, stood unbroken, brighter than the chandelier above their heads. The shame came slowly, like a shadow spreading across the table, dimming every sparkle of arrogance that had glittered so brightly before. One by one, their eyes turned toward him, not with laughter, not with pity, but with the dawning weight of truth too heavy to deny. The man they had exiled to the farthest corner, the man they had rationed food and words to, the man they told should be grateful just to be present, was not a relic clinging to the edges of their lives. He was the cornerstone, the root beneath their prosperity, the quiet architect of everything they now flaunted. The bank manager's words had stripped them bare. His voice, firm and sincere, had declared what they had spent years burying. Their fortunes stood on foundations they had not built. The son-in-law shifted uncomfortably, his smirk gone, his face pale. In his mind, the empire he boasted of now trembled, for it stood on ground his father-in-law had once paved. His victories, his deals, his very name in business, all of it had been watered years earlier by the discipline of the man he had mocked. And now, in front of everyone, the truth shone like a torch, exposing him as a child playing with borrowed tools. The daughter's shame was heavier still. She had been silent, folding her napkin, folding away her loyalty, watching her father humiliated without lifting her voice, and now she could not meet his gaze. The man she had ignored, diminished, betrayed with her stillness, was revealed as the one who had made her life of ease possible. She saw the truth not just in the bank manager's gratitude, but in the memories flooding back, the loans repaid, the nights her father came home too tired to speak, but still carried her gently to bed. She had built her silence into a wall, and now that wall collapsed on top of her. Around the table the others shifted, their faces betraying the same realization. Every toast they had raised without his name now soured on their tongues. Every laugh they had shared at his expense now echoed like chains in their ears. They remembered the whispers they had spoken just hours before, and each one became a dagger of guilt. The air itself was thick with their shame, pressing against them until their breaths came shallow and uneven. And yet he sat still. He had not risen, had not shouted, had not demanded justice. Justice had walked into the room uninvited, carried on the voice of a man whose respect could not be bought, and it had unveiled the truth with a simplicity that left no argument standing. They had pitied him, dismissed him, reduced him to a shadow, but now the shadow covered them instead, exposing the smallness of their pride against the vastness of his legacy. They lowered their eyes, but it was too late. The shame they felt was not just for what had been revealed, it was for what they had done, and what they could never undo. He did not rise with anger, nor did he reach for words to strike back. He did not point his finger at their shame, nor demand apologies that would taste hollow in their mouths. Instead, he sat in stillness, a calm more powerful than fury, and nodded once. That single gesture carried more weight than any speech could. His dignity, long ignored, long buried beneath their arrogance, spoke louder than all their insults combined. It filled the hall with a silence they could not escape, a silence heavy with truth that no denial could erase. For hours they had fed on his humiliation. They had laughed at his corner seat, belittled his knowledge, stripped him of honor with toasts that erased his name. Yet now, as he remained steady, unshaken, they saw the strength of a man who had no need to shout. Fury burns quickly. Dignity endures. His calmness was not weakness, it was triumph, and in its shadow their pride collapsed like brittle glass. The son-in-law dared not speak. His tongue, once sharp, felt clumsy in his mouth, for he knew anything he uttered now would reveal his smallness. The daughter's eyes, red and wet, clung to her lap, unable to lift toward the father who had borne her silence without flinching. The others shifted in their chairs, fidgeting with cutlery, with glasses, with anything that would distract them from the unbearable truth seated across from them. The man they had dismissed had never needed their recognition to stand tall. Justice had arrived that night, but it wore no crown of revenge. It came clothed in quiet respect, carried on the words of another, confirmed in the stillness of the one who had endured. It was not the justice of thunder or fire, but of light. Light that exposed what had been hidden, light that revealed where true strength had always lived, and that strength was not theirs. He did not need their remorse. He did not need their sudden tears or their faltering attempts at mended words. The very sight of their broken pride was enough. In their silence, in their bowed heads, in their hands trembling around crystal glasses, he found the vindication they could never take back. He had been erased, but now the truth stood carved into the walls of the hall itself. And so, without boasting, without fury, he sat tall. For dignity, once tested and proven, needs no defense. It shines on its own. When he rose from his chair, the sound of wood scraping against the polished floor was louder than their laughter had ever been. For the first time that night, every head turned toward him, not with mockery, not with pity, but with the stunned reverence of those who had seen truth unveiled too late. He did not hurry. He folded his napkin with deliberate care, placed it neatly on the table, and straightened his jacket. It was a simple act, yet in that silence it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. The very air in the hall shifted as he moved, once heavy with scorn, now thick with the awareness of dignity too great to be ignored. He did not look for their apologies. He did not wait for their stammered excuses or for trembling hands to reach out as if to pull him back. He knew what they would say if given the chance, knew the hollow promises that would fall from their lips once their pride had collapsed. But he did not need them. Respect, real respect, had already been spoken aloud by a voice that mattered, a voice from beyond the family that had betrayed him. The bank manager's words still hung in the air like an unshakable verdict, one no denial could erase. This man was not a shadow, not a burden, not lucky to be there. He was the cornerstone. He had always been. As he walked past them, their faces told the story his ears did not need to hear. The son-in-law, once so smug, now sat hunched, his smirk broken into a grimace of shame, his glass forgotten in his hand. The daughter could not raise her eyes from the floor, her shoulders trembling beneath the weight of silence she could not undo. And the others, those who had whispered, laughed, joined in the chorus of arrogance, shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet his gaze, their pride scattered like ash. But he did not linger on their shame. He carried himself with a calmness that came not from victory, but from freedom. He had no need to prove anything more. The truth had spoken, and it would echo long after he stepped out of the hall. He had given them his labor, his sacrifices, his years, and they had repaid him with betrayal. Yet in the end, it was not their betrayal that defined him. It was his endurance, his dignity, and the legacy already etched into the world beyond their narrow vision. When he reached the door, he paused, not to look back, but to feel the weight of the night settle into memory. He knew that behind him they sat broken, each of them confronting the truth they had buried for so long. They would remember that moment every time they raised a glass, every time they sat at a table he had made possible, every time the name they had tried to erase was spoken by others with respect. And his name would be spoken, it already was, in banks, in offices, in foundations that bore the mark of his discipline and vision. It was written not only in documents and contracts, but in the lives of those who had flourished because of him. He stepped into the night, the cool air embracing him, the stars above unbothered by the pettiness he had left behind. The house, the table, the false grandeur, It all seemed smaller now, insignificant compared to the vastness of the truth carried within him. They had thought they could reduce him to silence, but silence had become his strength. They had thought they could push him into shadows, but shadows had only sharpened the light that now revealed him. No betrayal, no insult, no silence could erase what he had built. For his legacy was not theirs to give, nor theirs to take away. It lived in stone, in ink, in memory, in the gratitude of those beyond blood. And long after their laughter faded and their arrogance withered, his name would endure, quiet, unshakable, carved into the very foundations of the life they had mistaken for their own. That night, when he left, they no longer saw a man lucky to be invited. They saw the architect of their fortunes, the true root of their prosperity, the name they could never erase. And though he walked alone into the darkness, the respect he carried lit the path before him brighter than any chandelier behind those doors ever could.